She's too emotional to be trusted with his life." That was my brother Grant, saying it in front of 4 doctors while our father lay 9 feet away with a tube in his arm. For 8 months, I had sat in that hospital, learned the names of every nurse, tracked every dose, slept upright in a vinyl chair. Grant had visited twice. And now he and our mother were telling the medical team that he would make every decision about whether our father lived or died, because I cried once in a waiting room. I didn't argue. I didn't cry that time. I just looked at my father's hand. What none of them knew was that there was a single piece of paper, signed and witnessed, that was about to take the whole room apart. The nurse hadn't set down the chart yet, but she was about to. I'm Adeline Hartley, 34, and I am the quiet one in my family, the one nobody listens to until it's too late to take it back. Let me tell you how 8 months in a hospital ended in one sentence I never saw coming. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of gray, ordinary morning that doesn't warn you about anything. My father, Walter, called me at 6:40 in the morning. He never called that early. His voice was wrong, thin, and far away, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. He said the left side of his face felt heavy. He said his coffee cup kept tipping. He said, very calmly, that he thought something was happening to him. I was already in my coat before he finished the sentence. I lived 20 minutes from him. My brother lived 12 minutes from him. I called Grant from the car. He didn't pick up. I called our mother, Patricia. She said Dad was probably just tired, that he'd had a long week, that I always made things into a crisis. I told her I was driving to him. She sighed like I was the inconvenience. I got there in 14 minutes. I broke the speed limit the whole way, and I would do it again. My father was sitting in his armchair, perfectly upright, his hands folded in his lap like a man waiting for a train. The right side of his face was working fine. The left side had simply stopped. His mouth pulled down on one side. When he tried to smile at me, only half of it moved. There's my girl," he said, and the words came out soft and wet. I called 911 from the kitchen so he wouldn't hear me sound afraid. The paramedics said the words I would come to live inside for the next 8 months. Stroke. Time is brain. They asked who would ride with him. I said me. Nobody else was there to argue. By the time my mother and brother arrived at the hospital, my father was already in imaging, and I had already given the intake nurse his medication list, his allergies, his date of birth, and the name of his cardiologist. I knew all of it by heart. I had been taking him to appointments for 2 years, ever since his first small heart scare, the one the family agreed not to talk about because it upset him. Grant walked in wearing a suit. He'd come from work. He looked at me sitting in the plastic chair and said, "What did you do?" "Not what happened. What did you do?" That is the first thing you need to understand about my brother. To him, if I was in the room when something went wrong, I had somehow caused it. I didn't answer. I handed him a paper cup of water from the dispenser because his hands were shaking and mine, by then, had gone very still. That was the difference between us that nobody would notice for 8 months. When things got bad, Grant got loud. I got quiet and exact. The doctor came out around noon. Ischemic stroke. They'd caught it in the window. They'd given the clot-busting drug. My father was stable, but the next 72 hours would tell us how much of him we'd keep. My mother started crying. My brother put his arm around her and steered her toward the cafeteria, telling her she needed to eat, that he'd handle everything. He said it loud enough for the doctor to hear. He'd handle everything. He went home that night at 8. I stayed until 2 in the morning, and I was back at 7. And that was the shape of the next 8 months, set in the first 8 hours, if any of us had been paying attention. But here's the part I didn't know yet. While I was learning the rhythm of that ICU, my mother and brother had already started telling a different version of events to anyone who would listen. And in that version, I was not the daughter who got there in 14 minutes. I was the daughter who couldn't handle it. My family is not poor, and we are not rich. We are the kind of family that looks solid from the outside. My father spent 31 years as a high school principal in our town. People still call him Mr. Hartley at the grocery store. He is the man who shook every graduate's hand and remembered their names 20 years later. My mother taught 3rd grade until she retired, and she has spent retirement perfecting the art of the pleasant, devastating remark. My brother, Grant, is a regional manager for a building supply company. And he has spent his whole life being the son who would carry the family name, which in our house meant the son whose opinions counted. I am a hospice and palliative care nurse. I have been one for 11 years. I tell you that now because it matters later, and because of how little it mattered to my family then. When I chose nursing, my mother told her friends I'd settled. When I specialized in end-of-life care, Grant asked me at Thanksgiving why I'd want a job where everybody dies. He laughed when he said it. My father didn't laugh. My father, the only one, said he thought it took a special kind of person to sit with someone at the end, and he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I have spent 11 years helping other families through the worst week of their lives. I know how a hospital works from the inside, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. I knew the difference between an attending and a resident. I knew what a Glasgow score meant. I knew that the most important conversations a family ever has happen in small windowless rooms, and that the person who stays calm in those rooms is usually the person nobody thanked. What I did not know was how to make my own family see me. For 2 years before the stroke, I had been the one taking my father to his cardiology appointments. After his heart scare, his blood pressure needed watching, his medications needed managing, and he hated all of it. He hated being a patient. So I made it bearable. I drove him. I sat with him. I asked the questions he was too proud to ask. We'd stop for a vanilla milkshake afterward every single time, because that was the bribe that got him through the blood draws. The waxed paper cup with the red straw, sweating in the cup holder of my car. He'd take exactly 3 long sips, then say the same thing every time. Don't tell your mother. She'll say it's bad for my heart. It was our joke. It was also, I see now, the only place in my family where I was the one who got to be trusted. The cardiologist's office knew me. They had my number as the first contact. When my father got confused about a dosage, they called me, not my mother. Once, the year before, his doctor had pulled me aside and said, gently, the way we say these things to families, that my father was getting older and that it might be worth talking to him about his wishes, about what he would want if there were ever decisions to make and he couldn't make them himself. I had that conversation with my father, in my car, over a milkshake. I'll tell you what he said in a minute, because it's the whole story. But on that gray October Tuesday, sitting in the ICU waiting room while my mother ate a sandwich she didn't want and my brother made phone calls about how he was handling everything, I didn't know yet that the conversation in my car would matter more than every loud thing Grant said for the next 8 months. I just knew my father was on the other side of that door and that I wasn't going home. By the 3rd day, my father woke up enough to know us. By the 3rd week, we knew what we'd kept and what we'd lost. He kept his mind. That was the mercy. He knew exactly who he was and who we were, and the principal who'd remembered 1,000 names still remembered all of ours. What the stroke took was the left side of his body and the easy authority of his voice. He had to fight for words now. They came slowly and out of order, and sometimes not at all, and you could watch the frustration build behind his eyes like water behind a dam. This is the part that broke my family open, though it took months for the crack to show. Because my father could not speak quickly anymore, people started speaking for him, and the loudest voice in any room was always Grant's. I noticed it first in small ways. A doctor would direct a question to my father, and before he could find the word, Grant would answer. A nurse would ask if Dad wanted to try the swallow test, and my mother would say, "Oh, he's not up for that today," without looking at him. I watched my father's face during these moments. I watched him give up, mid-sentence, again and again, his good hand going still on the blanket. I am trained to see exactly this. In my work, it is the thing I fight hardest against, the slow erasure of a person who is still fully present. So I did the thing I knew how to do. I slowed everything down. When a doctor came in, I'd say, "Give him a second. He has the answer. He just needs the time." And I'd wait. The room would get uncomfortable. And then my father would say the word, the right word, the one he'd been reaching for, and his eyes would find mine, grateful. Grant hated this. He said I was making it a whole thing. He said the doctors were busy. He said Dad was obviously too tired to decide and that someone had to be efficient about it. Efficient about our father's life. The first real fight happened over the feeding tube. There was a question about whether to place a temporary one while his swallowing recovered. The doctor laid out the options carefully and turned to my father. I started to say, "Give him a moment." And Grant cut across me. "He doesn't want it," Grant said. "Right, Dad? You don't want a tube. Nobody wants that." And my father, cornered, exhausted, looked at the doctor and then at Grant, and he did the thing that people do when they've been trained over weeks to surrender. He nodded. He agreed to the thing he'd been told he wanted, but his eyes were on me, and I knew that nod. I see that nod for a living. "Dad," I said quietly, "are you hungry?" The room went still. My mother said, "Adeline, don't badger him." My father looked at me and very slowly said one word. "Yes." We placed the tube. He recovered his strength enough to start real swallow therapy 2 weeks sooner than expected. The doctor told me, privately, that it was the right call. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, that night, my mother found me in the hallway and said the sentence that would become the family's official story. "You always have to be right," she said. "Even now, even here. You can't just let your brother lead." I want you to sit with the word she used, lead. As if our father's death were a meeting and there was a chairman. And before I could answer, she added the part that told me everything about the 8 months to come. "You get too emotional," she said. "We can't have that in here." I'd just been the calm one. I'd just been the one who slowed the room down and got the right answer. And she'd already rewritten it into the opposite. Before I go any further, if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I read every comment, and I like knowing who's sitting with me tonight. Now let me get back to that hallway and to what my mother said next. Because she wasn't finished, and neither was the long, strange campaign to push me out of my own father's care. The first organized move came 2 weeks later, and it had the shape of an ambush dressed as concern. My mother asked me to come to her house on a Sunday afternoon to talk about Dad's care as a family. I went because of course I went. When I walked into the living room I'd grown up in, Grant was already there, and so was my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, sitting on the good couch with her hands folded like a woman who'd been told her presence would lend gravity. It was an intervention, for me. My mother had a list. She'd written it on a legal pad because in my family, if you write something on a legal pad, it becomes true. She read it out loud, that I came to the hospital too often and smothered Dad, that I questioned the doctors, which she'd decided was a bad thing, that I'd made a scene about the feeding tube, that I was letting myself go and clearly not coping, that it would be healthier for everyone, she said, if I took a step back and let Grant be the one in charge and visited only on weekends. Visited only on weekends, my father, the one who got there in 14 minutes. My aunt nodded along because she'd been told a story and the story was sad and tidy and cast my mother as the strong matriarch holding the family together. Nobody in that room had set foot in the hospital that week. I had been there every day. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When my mother finished, she set down the legal pad and looked at me with the soft, victorious face of someone who believes she has just been kind. "Do you have anything to say?" she asked. I had a great deal to say. I said almost none of it because I had learned by then that in a room my family had stacked, winning the argument was not the same as winning, and that the only thing worse than being called too emotional was proving them right by becoming it. "I hear you," I said. "I'll think about everything you've said." And I stood up, and I thanked my aunt for coming, and I drove back to the hospital, and I sat with my father until midnight. In the car, for about a mile, I let myself believe they might be right. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the scapegoat. After enough years, when the whole family agrees on the story, some small, exhausted part of you starts to wonder if you really are the problem. I drove a mile wondering if I was smothering my dying father, if my steadiness was actually selfishness, if I should just step back and let them have it. Then I walked into his room, and he was awake, and his eyes found me the second I came through the door, the way they always did, and the small, exhausted, wondering part of me went quiet. Because a man who is being smothered does not look like that when you arrive. A man who is being smothered does not, with half a working face, fight to say, "There's my girl." I stayed. I would always stay. But I want you to know I wavered once, for 1 mile, because if I pretend I didn't, then I'm pretending this was easy, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done. I need to tell you about my brother, because anger is easy and the truth is more useful. Grant is 40. He is 3 years older than me, and for most of our childhood he was the proof of the family. He played football. He had the firm handshake. When our father, the principal, walked through town, Grant was the son he walked beside. I was the kid in the back seat with a book. But here is the thing nobody in my family will say out loud. Grant has been afraid of our father his whole life. Afraid of disappointing him. Afraid of the long, quiet principal's office silence that our father used instead of yelling. Grant spent 40 years trying to be a man big enough that our father would finally, fully approve of him. And now our father was dying, and the approval was running out of time. That is the motive nobody saw. Grant didn't take over Dad's care because he loved him most. Grant took over because if he could be the one who handled everything, the strong son at the deathbed, then maybe the ledger would finally balance. Maybe he could buy, at the very end, the thing he'd wanted his whole life, to be the good one. And I was in the way. Because I was actually doing the work, quietly, competently, without needing to be seen doing it. Every time a nurse thanked me by name, every time the attending asked for my read on Dad's pain levels, Grant heard the same thing he'd heard his whole life, that his little sister was better at the thing that mattered and getting the credit he needed. My mother's reasons were different and, in a way, sadder. Patricia had built her entire identity on a particular kind of family, the kind where the man is strong and the woman is cared for and the children fall into a clean line behind them. My father's stroke detonated that. He wasn't strong now. He needed care. And the person providing it, calmly and capably, was her daughter, the nurse she'd told everyone had settled. It would have cost my mother nothing to be grateful, but gratitude would have meant admitting that the daughter she'd dismissed was the one holding the family up. So instead, she chose the only story that let her keep her version of herself. In that story, I wasn't helping. I was hovering. I wasn't calm. I was cold. I wasn't trained. I was too emotional, which is a remarkable thing to call the same person you've also called cold. But contradiction has never slowed my mother down. By the second month, the story had hardened into fact. At my aunt's house, at church, at the grocery store, my mother told people that Grant had stepped up to manage everything, and that Adeline was having a hard time with it, poor thing. You know how she gets. You know how she gets, about the father she sat with every single day. I learned the story was out there from my cousin Becca, who called me one night, confused. She said her mom had told her I was too much of a wreck to be at the hospital much. Becca had laughed and said, "But you're a hospice nurse. Isn't that literally your whole job?" And then she'd gone quiet because she'd realized what she was telling me. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage when she called. It was 11 at night. I'd been there since 7 that morning. There was a cold milkshake in my cup holder, the one I'd brought up to my father's room that afternoon, and he'd managed 2 sips of before his face crumpled with the effort of it, and I'd quietly taken it away so he wouldn't have to feel like he'd failed. I looked at that milkshake while my cousin told me I was too much of a wreck to show up. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I didn't cry. I just felt something go very cold and very clear inside me, the way it does at work right before a long shift when I know I'm going to need to be steady for a family who can't be. I thought, they don't get to write this story, not this one. But I didn't know yet how I'd stop them. I had no document, no plan, nothing but 11 years of knowing how these things really go, and a father who could no longer speak for himself fast enough to defend me. What I didn't realize was that he already had. In the 4th month, the campaign stopped being about words and started being about access. It began with the visitor list. I came in one morning and the unit clerk stopped me at the desk, apologetic, and said there'd been a request to Streamline, who could make decisions and receive updates about my father. Grant had called the floor and asked that he be listed as the primary contact and that the staff run things by him before me. He'd told them, the clerk said gently, that I was a family member who was having difficulty coping. I want you to understand what that meant. It meant my brother, who visited on his schedule, had tried to turn me, the person there every day, into a visitor who needed permission. I didn't argue at the desk. I never argue at the desk. I asked, calmly, to speak to the charge nurse, and I explained that I had been my father's medical point of contact for 2 years before the stroke, that the cardiology office had me listed first, and that any change to a competent patient's contacts should be confirmed with the patient. The charge nurse, who had watched me for 3 months, fixed it in 5 minutes. But it had happened. And it would happen again. Then Grant tried the medications. He'd read something online about one of my father's blood thinners. He came in convinced it was what was making Dad worse, and he stood at the nurse's station and demanded they stop it, his voice rising, his manager's voice, the one that worked on warehouse staff and worked on no one in medicine. When the nurse explained patiently that the medication was preventing another stroke and that stopping it could kill him, Grant said she was just following a protocol and that he, the son, knew his father. I was in the doorway. I could have let him keep going and let the staff handle it. But this was my father's life, and I had stopped being willing to be quiet about that particular thing. Grant, I said, if they stopped that medication, he could throw another clot. It could kill him or take the rest of him. You're not protecting him. You're guessing loudly about something you don't understand. He turned on me in the hallway in front of the staff and said the cruelest thing he'd said yet. You want him to die, he said. That's what your whole job is, isn't it? Helping people die. You've already given up on him. You probably can't wait. The hallway went silent. A nurse looked at the floor. I felt the words land somewhere very deep in the exact place I'm most afraid of, because there is a version of that accusation I've asked myself at 3 a.m. after a hard shift. Whether choosing comfort over fighting is choosing death. Whether the calm I bring to dying families is a kind of surrender. I did not cry. I want that on the record because my mother would later swear I'd fallen apart in that hallway. I did not. I looked at my brother and I said, slowly, my job is making sure people aren't alone and aren't in pain when medicine runs out of miracles. That's not giving up. That's the opposite. And Dad's medicine hasn't run out yet, which is exactly why you don't get to stop his blood thinner because you read a forum. I walked away before he could answer, and I walked straight into the staff alcove, and I put both hands flat on the counter and breathed until the shaking in my chest went still. That's where Dolores found me. She didn't say anything at first. She just made me a cup of the terrible coffee and set it down and waited, the way I wait for families. My brother said I want our father to die, I said. My voice was very flat. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been doing this 26 years. You know what I've learned about families? The one screaming about fighting is usually the one who can't bear to be in the room, and the one they call cold is usually the only one who can actually sit still and love somebody who's dying. She picked up her own coffee. Your father's lucky. Most people in that bed don't have a you. I have been thanked many times in my work. I had never once been thanked in 11 years by my own family. And here was a stranger in scrubs with nothing to gain, telling me the thing I'd been starving to hear since I was a child. It was the first time in 8 months I came close to breaking. I didn't, but it was close. And the difference between me and my family is that I knew the difference between feeling something and being unable to do my job. They never learned it. They just called the feeling itself a disqualification. Dolores would matter more than either of us knew. She was off the day the conference would eventually be scheduled, and she would trade a shift to be there. I didn't ask her to. She just looked at me one afternoon and said, when the big meeting comes, I want to be the one with the chart. At the time, I didn't know what she meant. I do now. The thing about being the family member who's always at the hospital is that the hospital starts to know you. By the 3rd month, my father had moved from the ICU to a regular floor, then to the rehabilitation wing, then, after a setback with pneumonia, back to a medical floor. He went where the disease took him, and I went where he went. I knew the cafeteria's good days and bad days. I knew which parking level filled up first. I knew the night nurses by name and the day nurses by name and which of them would actually sit with him and which would just chart and leave. There was one nurse I want you to remember. Her name was Dolores. She'd been a floor nurse for 26 years, and she had the specific weary kindness of someone who has seen every kind of family there is and stopped being surprised by any of them. She and I recognized each other the way two people in the same trade do. She'd catch me reading my father's chart in the visitor chair, and she'd say, "You're one of us, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Hospice." And she'd nod like that explained everything, which it did. Dolores saw it all. That's the thing my mother and brother forgot. The staff sees everything. They see who's there at 6 in the morning and who shows up for the meeting with the doctor and then leaves. They see who knows the patient's medication and who has to ask. They see who the patient's eyes follow when they walk into the room. My father's eyes followed me, even on his worst days, especially on his worst days. One afternoon in the 3rd month, my mother and Grant came for one of their visits, the kind they scheduled around their own lives, and they brought a folder. Grant had been busy. Grant, it turned out, had gone to see a lawyer. Not a lawyer for my father, a lawyer for Grant. He spread the papers on the rolling table over my father's legs, the same table I used for the milkshakes, and he started explaining, in his manager's voice, that he was going to be filing for guardianship. He said it would simplify things. He said that with Dad unable to communicate clearly, someone needed legal authority to make medical and financial decisions, and that as the eldest, and given that I was struggling emotionally, it should be him. He said all of this in front of our father, about our father, as if he weren't lying right there, awake, his good hand opening and closing on the blanket. I looked at my dad. I watched him understand. I watched the principal who had run a school of 2,000 teenagers realize that his own son was, at his bedside, trying to take away his voice and call it kindness. My father said one word. It took him a long time to get it out, and the effort flushed his face red, and the word, when it finally came, was loud enough that a nurse looked in from the hall. No. Grant didn't even pause. "He's confused," Grant said to me, gathering his papers. "See? This is exactly why I need to handle it. He doesn't understand what's good for him." And that's when I said the only sharp thing I'd said in 3 months. He said no, Grant. Slowly doesn't mean stupidly. He said no. My mother stood up. "Adeline, you are making him agitated. Look at him. This is what we mean. You come in here and you stir everything up." She put her hand on my father's shoulder, the gentle, possessive hand of someone performing care for an audience. "We're trying to protect your father, and you're making it about you." I left the room. Not because I was upset, though I was. I left because I knew that if I stayed, I would say something that would let them be right about me. And I had decided in that parking garage that I was never going to let them be right about me again. I found Dolores at the nurse's station. She took one look at my face and pulled me into the little staff alcove with the coffee machine. "I heard some of that," she said. And then she said the thing that changed everything. She said it carefully, the way we say things when we're not sure we're allowed to. Has your dad ever filled out an advance directive, a healthcare proxy?" She paused. "Because if he has, none of what your brother is waving around in there matters at all." I felt the cold, clear thing in my chest tilt, because I knew the answer. I knew it the way you know a thing you put in a drawer 2 years ago and never had to open. He had. I'd watched him sign it, in my car, with a milkshake sweating in the cup holder. And nobody in my family knew it existed. I need to take you back, just for a minute, to that conversation in my car, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and I've been holding it from you the way I held it from my family. It was 2 summers ago. My father's cardiologist had pulled me aside after an appointment and said gently that it might be time to talk to Dad about his wishes. Not because anything was imminent, she'd said, but because the best time to have the conversation is always before you need it. I have that conversation with strangers for a living. I had never once had it with someone I loved. So that afternoon, I bought us the milkshakes and I drove us the long way home, the way along the river where the light comes through the trees, and I asked my father what he would want. He didn't dodge it. That surprised me. He took 3 long sips of his shake, set it in the cup holder, and said, "I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that. Your mother won't talk about it. Your brother thinks if we don't say the word, it can't happen." We talked for an hour in that parked car in his driveway. He told me he was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of disappearing while he was still alive. He was afraid of being talked over, decided about, managed. If it ever comes to it, he said, I want someone in the room who'll actually ask me what I want, and if I can't answer, I want someone who knows what I'd say. Mom? I asked. He shook his head slowly, and there was a whole marriage in that shake of the head. Your mother loves me, he said, but she'll do what's easiest for the family's feelings, not what's right for me. Grant? I didn't even need to ask, really. He almost laughed. Grant would shake the doctor's hand and agree with whatever sounded strongest. Your brother's a good man who's never once in his life sat still long enough to know what someone actually needs. Then he looked at me, this man who'd spent 31 years reading exactly who a person was, and he said, It's you. It was always going to be you. You're the only one who waits for the answer. We went to his attorney's office the following week. He named me as his healthcare proxy and his agent under a durable power of attorney for healthcare. He signed a living will. He did it clearly, of his own free will, witnessed and notarized 2 years before the stroke, when no one could ever claim he'd been confused or pressured. His attorney kept the original. I had a copy in a folder in a drawer in my apartment. And here is the thing I'm not proud of, and that I need to tell you honestly. For 3 months, I didn't use it. I could have walked into that hospital on day 1 and laid that document on the table and ended every argument before it started. I had the legal authority the whole time. Why didn't I? Because some childish, stubborn part of me wanted them to choose right on their own. I wanted my mother to look at me and see the daughter who got there in 14 minutes. I wanted my brother to just once say, You know more about this than I do, you decide. I wanted to be chosen, not to have to produce a piece of paper proving I already had been. It's the oldest wound I have. The one where I do everything right and still wait, hand out, for someone in my family to simply turn to me and say, We see you. You're the one we trust. I'd been waiting my whole life, and standing in that little alcove with Dolores, with my father's no still ringing down the hall and my brother's guardianship papers on the rolling table, I finally understood that the wait was the trap. They were never going to choose me. They didn't have to, my father already had. I just had to be brave enough to let it count. I went home that night and I took the folder out of the drawer. I didn't run back to the hospital and slam it down. That's not how this works, and that's not who I am. Instead, I did the careful thing. I called my father's attorney the next morning, a soft-spoken man named David Pruitt who had known my father for 30 years. I told him what was happening, the guardianship filing, the campaign, all of it. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, Adeline, your father did something very deliberate 2 years ago, and he did it precisely so this couldn't happen. A guardianship petition can't override a validly executed healthcare proxy unless someone proves your father was incompetent when he signed it, and he wasn't, and we have the documentation to prove he wasn't. Your brother is frankly wasting his money. Then he said the thing I'll never forget. Your father told me the day he signed it that he was doing it to protect you, not himself. You. He said, My family won't listen to Adeline until she's holding a piece of paper, so give her the paper. I had to put the phone down for a minute. My father had known. 2 years ago, before any of this, he had known exactly how my family would treat me in the worst moment of our lives, and he had quietly built me a shield and put it in a drawer and never mentioned it, because he didn't want to make me feel like he doubted them. He just wanted me protected when the day came. The milkshake. The long way home along the river. He hadn't been saying goodbye to his independence that afternoon. He'd been making sure that when no one else would listen to me, the law would. David told me what to do. He said the directive should be formally entered into my father's medical record at the hospital, which I, as the named proxy, had every right to do. He said he'd send the certified copies directly to the hospital's medical records and the care team. He said there would likely come a moment, a family meeting, where it would all have to come out, and that I should let it. Don't ambush them, he said, but don't protect them from the truth either. They've had 3 months. It's time. I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments because I've gone back and forth on it for 2 years. If you'd been me, would you have used that document on day 1? Or would you have waited the way I did, hoping your family would do the right thing on their own? Tell me. I really want to know how many of us are still waiting to be chosen. But before the paper could enter the room, something happened that I should have seen coming and didn't. The morning after I spoke to David Pruitt, I went to his office to pick up the certified copies. And David, who had handled my father's affairs for 30 years, met me in the lobby with an expression I didn't like. "We have a small problem," he said. The original directive was supposed to be in my father's file. It had been there for 2 years, but when David's paralegal had gone to pull it that morning to certify copies, the physical original wasn't in the folder. The signed living will was there. The durable power of attorney for healthcare, the document that named me as agent, the one that mattered most, was not. I felt the floor tilt. "Someone requested a copy of your father's estate file 3 weeks ago," David said carefully. "In person. Said he was Walter's son, here on his father's behalf. My new receptionist didn't know better. She let him review the file in the conference room, unsupervised, for 20 minutes. Grant. 3 weeks ago, right around when he started talking about guardianship." "Did he take it?" I asked. David didn't want to accuse anyone of a crime, and to be fair, we couldn't prove it. The original might have been misfiled. It might have slipped behind a drawer. But David's face told me what he thought, and what I thought, and what you're thinking right now. My brother had gone looking, found the one document that ended his whole plan, and the document had vanished. I want to be honest about the next 24 hours because they were the lowest point of those 8 months, lower even than the parking garage. Because for the first time, I believed I might actually lose. Without the original, David explained, things got harder. The living will established my father's wishes, yes. But the power of attorney, the document that gave me the legal authority to enforce those wishes over my brother's objection, was the keystone. If Grant filed for guardianship now and claimed no valid proxy existed, we'd be in a fight in court while my father lay dying. Exactly the chaos my father had signed the thing to prevent. I drove to the hospital that night with nothing in my folder but a useless copy of a living will and the worst feeling I'd had in my professional life. The feeling of watching a family lose to itself. I sat in the parking garage, same level. There was no milkshake this time. There was just me and the long fluorescent hum and the certainty closing in that my father was going to spend his last days exactly the way he was most afraid of, talked over, decided about while his children fought because his loud son had found the one piece of paper and made it disappear. And then I remembered something Dolores had said, almost in passing, weeks before. She'd said the patient's eyes follow you into the room. And I thought about David Pruitt saying the original was missing, and I realized I'd been looking at the problem like a daughter, panicking. I needed to look at it like a nurse, the way I look at a chart when a family swears something is true and the body says otherwise. The original was missing from David's office. Fine. But David's office wasn't the only place that paper had ever been. I called David back at 9 at night. He answered. I asked him one question. When my father signed the durable power of attorney for healthcare 2 years ago, had a copy ever been sent anywhere else? To a doctor? To a hospital? Anywhere a record might still exist that my brother couldn't reach? There was a pause, and then the sound of David walking, and then the sound of a filing cabinet, and then David Pruitt said the words that pulled me back from the edge. Yes, he said. When your father executed it, he asked me to send a certified copy directly to his cardiologist to keep with his medical records. He said, and I remember this, he said, put it somewhere my family can't lose it. My father, 2 years early, in my car, drinking a milkshake. He hadn't just built me a shield. He'd made a second copy of the shield and hidden it where the one person who'd try to take it would never think to look. With the cardiologist who had my number, not my brother's. The cardiologist's office I'd driven him to for 2 years while Grant didn't even know the doctor's name. I started laughing in that parking garage. Alone, at 9 at night, exhausted. I laughed until I cried, because my father had outthought my brother 2 years before my brother ever started thinking. The cardiologist's office had the certified copy in their records. David obtained it the next morning. It was as valid as the original, a true certified copy executed and notarized 2 years ago, untouched by anyone in my family. Grant had made his keystone document disappear. And it had simply, quietly, been waiting somewhere else the whole time, put there by the one man who'd known his own son well enough to know he'd try. I never told Grant I knew about the missing original. I never had to. Some justice doesn't need to be spoken. It just needs to be true. Now let me tell you what happened when the paper finally entered the room. The thing I'd learned in 11 years of this work is that hospitals run on documents, and the moment the right one enters the chart, everything quietly reorganizes around it. I drove the certified copies to the hospital's medical records department myself the next morning. I filled out the form. I showed my ID. The clerk, a young man who didn't know my family from any other family, scanned the healthcare proxy and the living will into my father's record, attached me as the legally documented decision-maker, and printed me a confirmation. It took 11 minutes. 3 months of being called too emotional. Undone by an 11-minute administrative task I'd been too wounded to do. I went up to my father's room. He was awake. The morning light was coming through the blinds in long stripes across his blanket. I sat down and took his good hand. "I called David," I said, "about what you signed 2 years ago." He went very still. Then his eyes filled, and I watched the principal who'd held 1,000 assemblies without a tremor try and fail to keep his face composed. "You found it," he said. The words came slow. "I wondered if you'd ever need it." "I need it now, Dad." He squeezed my hand with everything the stroke had left him. "Then use it," he said. "That's what it's for." I didn't tell my mother or my brother that day. David was right that there'd be a meeting, and there was. But the meeting wasn't of my making. It came because my father took a turn. The pneumonia came back, harder. His oxygen dropped. The medical team needed to make real decisions now, fast ones, about how aggressive to be, about whether to escalate to the ICU again and put him on a ventilator, about what my father would actually want if his heart stopped. These are the exact decisions my father had signed that document to control. These are the decisions he'd told me, in my car over a milkshake, that he did not want made by people who'd do what was easiest for the family's feelings. And so the hospital did what hospitals do when a patient is at a crossroads. They called a family care conference. A doctor's assistant phoned my mother, my brother, and me. We were all together in the family conference room on the 4th floor at 2 o'clock the next afternoon, with my father's attending physician, the palliative care doctor, a social worker, and the charge nurse to discuss goals of care. My mother called me an hour later, and her voice was tight with strategy. "Grant and I have talked," she said. "We've decided that at this meeting, Grant is going to be the one to speak for the family. It's too much for you, Adeline. You're too close to it, too emotional. We need someone level-headed in there. Grant will make the decisions and we'll all support him. Don't argue. For once, just let your brother lead. Do this for your father. Do this for your father." She actually said that. "Step aside for your father." I held the phone and I looked out my window for a long moment. And then I said the calmest true thing I have ever said. "Okay, Mom, I'll see you tomorrow at 2. I hung up before she could hear that I was smiling and that the smile had nothing to do with happiness. It was the smile you smile when you've stopped fighting for a thing because you've realized you already have it. Because they thought they were walking into a meeting to decide who would lead. They had no idea they were walking into a room where the question had already been answered. 2 years ago. In my car. By the one man whose answer was the only one that mattered. The 4th floor conference room had a long table and a box of tissues in the center of it, the way these rooms always do. I have sat at that kind of table 100 times on the other side, as the nurse who guides the family. I had never once sat at it as the family. I got there first. I always get there first. I sat down with my folder, the certified copies inside it, and I waited. My brother arrived at 5 past, in a suit again, with our mother on his arm. He had a legal pad. He'd prepared. Of course he had. Grant had spent his whole life preparing to finally be the man in charge, and he'd decided that the room where our father's life was being weighed would be his stage. He sat at the head of the table without asking if it was his to take. My mother sat at his right hand. They left me a chair down the side, the way you'd seat a junior member of staff. The medical team filed in. Dr. Okonkwo, the attending, Dr. Reyes from palliative care, a social worker named Janelle, and, last, in her scrubs, with the patient chart under her arm, Dolores. She caught my eye for half a second. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, the smallest possible nod. The nod of one professional to another who both know what's about to happen in a room full of people who don't. Dr. Okonkwo began. He explained my father's condition plainly. The pneumonia, the dropping oxygen, the fact that we were approaching the point where decisions about escalation of care, about a ventilator, about resuscitation, needed to be made clearly and in advance while there was time rather than in a crisis at 3 a.m. He said, "So the most important thing for us today is to understand your father's wishes and to know who is making decisions on his behalf." And my brother stood up. He actually stood at the head of the table and buttoned his suit jacket like a man at a podium and began to speak. "Thank you, Doctor. I'm Grant Hartley, the eldest. I'll be handling decisions for my father. I've discussed it with my mother, and we're in agreement." He glanced down the table at me just briefly, the way you check that a door is closed. "My sister is also here, but she's been having a very hard time with all this emotionally, so to keep things clear, I'll be the point of contact and the decision maker. As for my father's wishes, I knew him best. He was a strong man, a fighter. He'd want us to do everything, full resuscitation, the ventilator, all of it. He'd want us to fight." He sat down, satisfied. My mother reached over and patted his hand. He had just gotten our father exactly, precisely backward. My father, who had told me in a parked car that his only fear was disappearing while still alive, being kept going by machines, decided about by people doing what was easiest. Grant had stood up in front of the medical team and ordered the one thing our father had specifically, legally, asked never to happen. And he'd called me too emotional to be in the room. Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly, professionally, and turned to make a note. Dr. Reyes glanced at the social worker, and in that small pause, that quiet, ordinary pause, Dolores stepped forward and set the chart down on the table. She set it down flat, deliberately, the way you set down something you want everyone to see. "Before we go any further," Dolores said, her voice even, 26 years steady, "I think the team needs to clarify something about decision-making authority, because there's a document in the chart that hasn't been mentioned yet." She looked at Dr. Okonkwo. "Mr. Hartley executed a healthcare proxy and a living will 2 years ago. They were entered into the record yesterday by the named agent. Legally, only one person in this room can make these decisions for him." The room went quiet in a way I have rarely heard, even in my work. The specific silence of people recalculating reality. "And," Dolores said, looking directly at my brother for the first time, "it isn't you. I have replayed the next 10 minutes more times than I can count. I'll tell them to you exactly because the details are the whole point." My brother's face did something I'd never seen it do. The confidence didn't drain slowly. It cracked. "There's no such document," he said. "I'm his son. I would know." Dr. Okonkwo had the chart open now. He read for a moment, then looked up. "There is a durable power of attorney for healthcare and a living will, both validly executed 2 years ago, notarized with 2 witnesses. The named healthcare agent is—" He found the line. "Adeline Hartley." Every head at that table turned to me. I didn't stand up. I didn't button a jacket. I stayed in my seat, one chair down the side, and I opened my folder and I slid the certified copies into the middle of the table next to the tissues. "That's me," I said quietly. "I'm his proxy. He chose me 2 years ago." My mother found her voice first, and it came out shrill. "That's not possible. He never told us. Walter would never go behind our backs. You manipulated him. You took him to some lawyer and—" "He went to David Pruitt," I said. "His attorney of 30 years. The one who handled the sale of the lake cabin, Mom." "You've met him. Dad signed it of his own free will, 2 years before the stroke, fully competent, witnessed and notarized. There's no manipulation in the record. There's just his signature." Grant slammed his palm on the table. "I'm filing for guardianship. I have a lawyer. We'll have this thrown out." Dr. Reyes spoke for the first time, gently, in the voice palliative doctors use. "Mr. Hartley, a guardianship petition would have to prove your father was incompetent when he signed the directive 2 years ago. Was he? Was your father, 2 years ago, not in his right mind?" And there it was, the trap my father had built, 2 years early, quietly, while drinking a milkshake in my car. Because Grant could not say yes. He could not stand in that room and claim that our father, the principal, the man he'd spent his whole life trying to impress, had been incompetent and senile 2 years ago. To win the guardianship, he'd have to destroy the very father he was claiming to honor. Grant's mouth opened and closed. "He was fine 2 years ago," my mother said, almost to herself, the realization landing on her face. "He was completely fine." "He was," I said. "He was fine." And he was thinking very clearly about exactly this moment, about this exact room. I turned to Dr. Okonkwo, and I did the thing I'd been quietly waiting 11 years and 3 months and one parked car afternoon to do. I spoke for my father, the way he'd asked me to. "My father's living will is explicit," I said. "He does not want prolonged mechanical ventilation if there's no reasonable expectation of meaningful recovery. He does not want CPR. He told me, 2 years ago in his own words, that his greatest fear was being kept alive as a body while the man was already gone. He wanted comfort. He wanted dignity. He wanted, his exact words, someone in the room who'd actually ask him what he wanted." I looked at my brother. "He didn't choose me because I'm the favorite, Grant. He chose me because I'm the one who waits for the answer. You stood up and ordered everything he was terrified of. You did it to be the strong son, and you got him completely wrong." That's when my brother stopped being angry and started being something worse, self-pitying. "I was trying to help," he said, and his voice broke, and for 1 second I saw the frightened boy who'd spent 40 years failing to earn a nod. "I was finally trying to be there for him. And you had a secret document the whole time. You let me make a fool of myself. And here is where it would have been easy to be cruel, and where my father's whole life as a principal had taught me not to be." "You weren't a fool, Grant," I said. "You were loud. There's a difference. Dad knew you loved him. He just knew you'd fight for what looked strong instead of what he wanted. And he was right. You walked in here 10 minutes ago and ordered the exact opposite of his wishes, with total confidence, and called me too emotional to be trusted with his life." I let that sit. I've been at his bedside for 3 months. I know his medication schedule. I know which nurse he likes. I know he takes 3 sips of a milkshake and then can't manage more, and I know to take it away before he feels like he failed. That's not being emotional. That's being there. The social worker quietly slid the box of tissues toward my mother, who had started, finally, to cry the real kind. Then my mother said the thing that ended it. The daisy cutter, except it cut the other way this time. She looked at me, mascara running, and out of 3 months of practiced certainty, she pulled the only weapon she had left. "You're too emotional to be trusted with his life." She'd said it so many times it came out automatically, even now, even with the document on the table. And Dolores, 26 years on the floor, with nothing to gain and her shift about to end, said quietly, without looking up from the chart, "Ma'am, with respect, she's the only one in this family who's been here every day. I've watched her. The patient's eyes follow her into the room. The patient's eyes follow her into the room." My mother had no answer for that. There isn't one. You cannot argue with the thing a man's own eyes do. The room rearranged itself, the way rooms do once the right document is on the table. Dr. Okonkwo confirmed that decisions would proceed according to my father's directive and that I, as his agent, would be the point of contact. He said it kindly, but he said it as fact, and there is no appeal from a fact in a hospital. We did not put my father on a ventilator. We did not order CPR. We did the thing he asked for, which was so much harder and so much braver than fighting. We made him comfortable. We let him be present. We let him be a person, all the way to the end, instead of a battle the family fought over his body. He lived 11 more days. They were the best 11 days of those 8 months, and I will tell you about them because the story doesn't end at the conference table. The reveal isn't the point. What comes after the reveal is the point. If you have ever sat in a room where your family decided about you instead of with you, and you found a way to set the record straight without becoming the cruel thing they accused you of being, I want to hear about it. Tell me below. There are more of us than anyone admits. Those 11 days changed my family. Not all at once, and not in the tidy way it happens in movies. But they changed. My brother came every day after that meeting, not to manage, not to handle, He'd run out of performance, and what was underneath the performance turned out to be a man who genuinely didn't know how to sit at a bedside. So I taught him. I showed him how to swab Dad's mouth when it got dry. I showed him how to read the little signs of discomfort that Dad couldn't say out loud anymore. The first time Grant got it right, the first time he saw the tension leave our father's face because Grant had noticed and fixed it himself, he looked at me across the bed with an expression I'd waited my whole life to see. It wasn't approval. It was something better. It was respect. "How did you learn all this?" he asked me one night quietly, the loud gone out of him. "By being here," I said. "That's the whole secret. You just stay and you pay attention and you let the person be a person." He nodded. Then he said, "I'm sorry. For the meeting, for the—" He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. I'd watched my father struggle for words for 3 months. I knew how to wait for them. "I know," I said. And I let it be enough, because in my work I have learned that some apologies arrive too late to fix anything and just in time to mean everything. On the 6th day, Grant brought a milkshake. He didn't know about the milkshakes. Nobody had told him. He just remembered from somewhere far back that our father loved vanilla, and he'd stopped on the way and bought one without knowing he was walking straight into the most sacred thing between our father and me. He held it up, sheepish, like he wasn't sure it was allowed. I looked at my father, and my father looked at the cup, and then he looked at me, and the smallest crooked smile pulled at the working half of his face. He knew. I knew. And I decided, in that second, not to tell Grant what he'd stumbled into, because some gifts are better for not knowing how perfectly they land. 3 sips, I told my brother quietly. Then I take it away before he gets tired. That's the rule. Don't make a thing of it when I do. Grant nodded, serious as a man receiving a sacrament, and held the straw to our father's lips, and watched, and when I reached over after the 3rd sip to take it away, he didn't argue. For the first time in his life, my brother let me be the one who knew. It was a small thing. It was everything. My mother was harder. Pride is a long road back, and Patricia walked it slowly. But on the 8th day, she came in alone, and she sat down next to me, and she watched me adjust my father's pillow and check his hands for warmth, and after a while she said, not looking at me, "He used to tell me you'd be the one who could handle the hard things." I thought he was being unfair to Grant. She paused. "He wasn't being unfair to Grant. He was just telling the truth about you." It wasn't an apology. My mother doesn't have the equipment for a clean apology, but it was the closest she'll ever come, and from her it was an enormous amount, and I took it. On the 10th day, my father had a good afternoon. The light came through the blinds in those long stripes again. He was tired, but he was there, all the way there, the principal still home behind his eyes. I asked him if he wanted anything. It took him a while, but he got the words out, one at a time, with a crooked half-smile. "Milkshake," he said. "Vanilla, don't tell. Your mother." My mother was sitting right there. She heard it, and for the first time in maybe 40 years of marriage, she laughed instead of correcting him. "Oh, get him the milkshake, Adeline," she said, wiping her eyes. "What's it going to do? Kill him?" It was the kindest, blackest, most honest joke my mother ever made, and the 3 of us, my mother and my brother and me, laughed in that hospital room until we cried, while my father took 3 long sips of a vanilla milkshake through a red straw and then, gently, let me take it away before he had to feel like he'd failed. He died 2 days later, early in the morning, with my hand in his good hand and the gray light just starting at the window. He wasn't on a machine. He wasn't surrounded by people fighting over him. He was comfortable, and he was a person, and he was not alone, which was every single thing he'd asked me for in a parked car 2 years before, when he still had all his words. Dolores was working that morning. She came in after, and she stood at the end of the bed for a moment, and then she said to me, "You did it right. Most families never get to. You did. I keep one thing on my kitchen windowsill now. It's a red plastic straw, the kind from the drive-thru, washed and dried, standing in a small glass. My family thinks it's a strange thing to keep. Let them. It's the most important document I own, even though there's nothing written on it. It says, I was the one who waited for the answer. Here is what I know now, that I didn't know in that parking garage at 11 at night, looking at a milkshake while my own cousin told me I was too much of a wreck to show up. The people who call you too emotional are very often the people who are afraid of what you can see. My family didn't push me out because I couldn't handle my father's death. They pushed me out because I could, and because the calm, steady, paying attention love I had for him made their noise look like exactly what it was. I spent my whole life waiting to be chosen by my family. It turned out I'd been chosen all along, quietly, 2 years early, by the one of them who actually knew me. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't even tell me he'd done it. He just made sure that when the day came and no one would listen to me, there would be a piece of paper in a drawer that meant they'd have to. If you take one thing from my story, take this. Go have the milkshake conversation. With your parents, with your partner, with anyone you love. Ask them what they'd want while they still have all their words. Fill out the directive. Name the person who waits for the answer. Don't make someone you love have to prove, in the worst week of their life, that they were trusted all along. My name is Adeline Hartley. I'm 34. I'm the quiet one in my family, the one nobody listened to until a nurse set down a chart and a single signed page made them stop. And the last thing my father ever asked me for was a milkshake. And the last thing he ever gave me was the right to be the one who said no when it mattered, and yes when it mattered, and to hold his hand at the end while the gray light came up. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.